Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemen. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry J. Chesler, Solomon Shagda Day School at Long Island, and Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky in New York City. Anshe Chesed, it's great to see you. We have this amazing Parsha to talk about. This is Parashat Bo, Shmot Va'era Bo. This is the third Parsha in the book of Shmot. We are 7 plagues into the 10 plagues. And here the Parsha starts with this. We'll just start where the Parsha starts. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Bo el Paro, go to Pharaoh. Ki ani ichbarati et libo v'et lev avadav. I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants. Leman shiti ototai ele b'kirpo, so that my signs, my wonders can be present in front of him. You know what? I wanted to kind of go, take a little bit of a 30,000 look and ask what may be an obvious question, at least to me. Why didn't Pharaoh just lock him up? Why didn't he just off?
Before we get there,
go ahead.
I wanted to point out something. We expect to have the word lech, go to Pharaoh. So it seems like a suggestion, especially in the way the Parsha unfolds, that God is already in Egypt, in the palace, and he's inviting Moshe to come join him in front of Pharaoh.
I think I really like that observation, because I would do maybe a teeny bit different that, well, whatever. Lech is also pursue your destiny. Abraham, of course, Lech Lecha, go somewhere is a journey, but to come, it seems like Moshe is arriving at some place where he's supposed to be. In this confrontation with Paro. Why doesn't Pharaoh just lock him up?
Wait. Don't forget the expression Bo El Paro is not unique to this, movement. We have it in chapter 9, the previous Parsha. I think we have it a couple other times in the previous Parsha, but I love the drush on that.
The nuance on coming is. Okay. So why doesn't Pharaoh just lock him up? As a matter of fact, not only would that make a certain amount of logic, especially in American life and even in Israel, where people are saying their opponents should be locked up. Everyone should be locked up.
I think we had a political leader in our country who suggested that.
I think that's true. I think it's true. So there's a way in which, in a power imbalance, the irony of this confrontation is that Pharaoh seems like he's got all the power, but Moshe actually has all the power. So the space in between, the irony of where you think, where the ostensible meaning at the pshat level, but the true meaning at the deep level is the opposite. And so Pharaoh is all powerful. He's the titanic emperor of this huge powerful nation. And this little pisher is coming up and he's making some audacious request. It's like, I think Pharaoh, at least for the beginning of this, just considers Moshe beneath contempt, no threat at all. I don't know who your God is. You're not even worth my time. Of course, that gets out of hand, but you sort of wonder, why he doesn't just kill him or lock him up or something like that. But we do know that the Egyptians, by the way, they like to lock up people. That's the beginning of the Egypt story. Back with Joseph, they like to lock up people, and even Pharaoh,
not just Joseph,
likes to lock up his servants.
Right.
So what I would add. Yeah, I think Jeremy made an excellent observation, is that I'm reminded, I haven't read the story in a long, long time, of The Blue Hotel by Stephen Crane, which is a series of events where one inexorably leads to the other. And what we're seeing here is a chain of events that in retrospect, you wonder why it came to this, because it could have been stopped at any point, right? Pharaoh could have locked him up. He might have done worse to him. But he's so wrapped up that he can't make the astute decision that he needs to make, because he doesn't realize what the game actually is that he's playing.
Well,
so he's making it one decision after another. Yeah.
Let's give Pharaoh a certain benefit of the doubt. Let's say that he has some wisdom and that he's made a calculation. And what would be his calculation? Well, on the one hand, you're saying, well, I've got all the power. This is a nuisance. What am I going to do? Or does he say something like, do I benefit from assassinating him? Do I benefit from putting him away? or will I cause more damage by doing that? Look, I mean, we were talking about political enemies in Russia. So there's something called sudden Russian oppositional death syndrome, where opponents of Putin end up in a ditch or off a balcony or in a car accident, and all of a sudden, one, two. Now there are about half a dozen, maybe a dozen of them that have ended up that way. But Navalny, his major opponent, is in jail somewhere.
So
What would happen if he tried to assassinate him? Right, in jail, I think. And that suggests what, Barry?
So one of my early loves was politics and political science, and there's an old rule that in politics, power is greater when it's potential, not when it's actually used. So that we could look at Pharaoh as trying to preserve his power by not executing it, by executing Moshe. So that as long as he doesn't have to make a move, he actually has more power because people think he has it. Once he uses that power, it's gone, then it's hard to get it back again. But the other thing we were talking about earlier before we started recording is that to kill the enemy is actually a sign of weakness, not of strength. And at some point that will penetrate to the people that the Pharaoh needs. When you run a slave country, you need to keep the slaves docile, right? You don't want your great fear always is that there's going to be a rebellion, which was Pharaoh's concern in chapter 1. And so you don't want to do anything that's going to rock the boat unless it's absolutely necessary. And the problem always is, when do you know that it's absolutely necessary? And sometimes you recognize too late.
Well, is it ever effective? Is political assassination ever an effective tool? I mean,
well, I think it's
imagine
worked
a
well
scenario he doesn't have the ability to crush the entire population. The population would have gone crazy. They could have.
It's funny that we're having this conversation now, because over the years, the three of us have many times talked about, politics and the security situation and the violence in Israel, and we have, maybe generally speaking, Elliot has been a little bit more hawkish on some of these things than me or Barry, but Israel is a country that engages in political assassination, and sometimes I kind of feel pleased to hear it. I don't mind that the Hamas guys or the Islamic Jihad guys don't go to bed feeling confident. I like that they go to bed feeling nervous, and yet it can also be the argument that you just made, which is you can't kill everyone in Gaza, and you're just fomenting more and more opposition to yourself every time you kill a Hamas fighter.
It's in a war situation. There are calculated risks when they use targeted assassinations. Look, and the Americans killed Soleimani in Iraq. That was that was like the end of the chess game. Okay,
didn't Israel kill him? I noticed that Trump claimed credit for that the other day, but I think Israel killed him. No,
Soleimani was killed by the Americans.
Oh,
Israel.
Okay.
No, so in a war, everything is on the table. This is not a war. This is a rebellion, an insurrection. I want to ask this question. I want to pose this. Do you think Pharaoh likes the game? Do you think Pharaoh needs the opponent? And here I'm, studying this. I happened to being reviewing this chapter a while ago, and I had just seen a testimony, a Holocaust testimony. Of a chazan in Ottawa. His name was Moshe Krauss, and the commandant in whatever camp he was in kept him on because he was a good singer, and in other words, he needed to preserve his own myth of his own humanity. That is, the evil person, the commandant, needed to preserve the mythology of his humanity by keeping this guy alive. He needed him for his own benefit. And I do wonder whether or not Pharaoh is keeping Moses alive because he needs the game. He needs the competition. You do need your opponent.
In these latter plagues, Pharaoh's fallen to pieces, and he says, "I'm guilty, I'm guilty, I'm guilty," and then Moshe says, "Okay, I'm going to make the plague go away," and Pharaoh says, "Yeah, I take that back. I'm not that guilty. Listen, I can understand. All right, you can go. No, you can't go. You can go, but you have to leave your children and your livestock here." So Pharaoh's kind of losing it, and he's contradicting himself. He's promising one thing, he's going another way. His walls are breaking, and we often talk, interpreters of these passages. One of the classic questions to ask is: God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Isn't this massively unfair? Isn't God just extending out Pharaoh's suffering and the Egyptian suffering? Isn't God robbing Pharaoh of his own free will? That seems to contradict the basic principle of religion and the importance of each human being's decisions and behavior. But I think that Vaychazek Adonai et lev Paro, the V'hichbadati et libo, I hardened his heart, I strengthened his heart, means I gave him courage to be the person that he wants to be. Pharaoh has chosen his path. He is the person who rules by dint of his, tremendous tyrannical power or whatever. And now he's getting a whooping, and the locusts have eaten his food. The hail has destroyed his food. The country's plunged into darkness. And God's giving Pharaoh the strength to be able to say, you think you're going to beat me with a little darkness? You're going to beat me with darkness. I'm hanging in there.
So, Elliot, you make a great observation, but the game here is diplomacy, and we often use the word game in two different ways. This is not a game like Monopoly, but a game in the way of not unlike Johan Huizinga, the great Flemish historian, wrote about in his book Homo Ludens, a ritualized behavior between human beings. And it suddenly occurs to me that because we're Jews, obviously, we read the Torah oftentimes through a very narrow lens. The question that it would be worth thinking about is, what is Pharaoh's endgame? Right, this is a diplomatic problem. He has Moshe, who represents or claims to represent all these slaves. It's clear what Moshe wants the endgame to be. He wants to leave Egypt, but how does Pharaoh think it's going to end?
Yeah,
and that may also be why he doesn't kill him.
He wants permanent subjugation. He wants a permanent class of slaves, because that's the structure of Egyptian society requires.
So does that actually make sense of his responses then? Or how does it make sense of his responses?
Keep the status quo, keep a class of people so that he can remain in power and he can sustain an economy that is built.
So he's going to keep letting Moshe and Aaron come. He's going to talk to them for a few minutes, tell them whatever he thinks they want to hear, and then contradict it as soon as necessary.
Exactly. No, I think you made a really interesting insight that the wavering here that we see, which requires his, God, an external source at this point in the story, which is God, to harden his heart, to keep him steadfast. I think that's crucial. I
would just ask a couple of questions about this. Of course, is not surprising and natural and sensible that we always read these things through our own experience and the contemporary world that we live in, and so we kind of filter this ancient story through that. It's all but impossible for a modern North American to not read this in conversation with Black slavery in the United States. And so you just made a description. He wants a steady supply of labor. He wants built a whole economy on this. It seems to me that while those things might apply to Egypt, I don't think the Torah necessarily says those things about Egypt. We always say stuff like, well, we built the pyramids, and actually the pyramids were much longer before the Bible. I don't really know the role. I mean, Black slaves, African slaves, obviously kept up an economy in the American South, and they needed the free labor or cheap labor, because of course it wasn't exactly free. They were sustaining them, buying them, trading them. But I'm not sure that that's true in Egypt. It may simply be the case that Egypt's a massive country. They probably got a gazillion slaves, and even if there's one little people left, they would still have plenty of other slaves. And
it's only when
Moshe leaves with like an Erev Rav that Egypt is a mess. I think that there may simply be just straight up cruelty, not economic calculation in enslaving Israelites.
But there's also a political calculation here, which is if I have an insurrection among one group of slaves, that's going to spill over to the other slaves. You're saying, I think rightly so, that they weren't the only slaves in Egypt. So what would happen if one group of slaves follows their leader? So we have this quote unquote Erev Rav, that a mixed multitude that leaves with them, but Egypt doesn't empty out completely of slaves, and slavery exists in Egypt. I don't know, still beyond this time for several hundred years probably. Slavery is part of every ancient society.
There's not until modern times does anybody come up and say, oh yeah, slavery is wrong in principle for all societies in all places and all times. There's no way that agricultural societies built, the things that they built without slaves. And the modern, Declaration of Human Rights says slavery is wrong at all times, in all places, and in all circumstances, even though it's not entirely fulfilled in the world today.
But I would give a reading of the Bible that the Bible, while understands the existence of the institution, also undermines slavery. We're getting ahead of ourselves, because that's, when the 10 Commandments are given, the commandment to keep Shabbat includes that your slave will rest, okay, which is in a way a radical iteration of what a slave is. If a slave is entitled to rest, that undermines slavery. So built within.
Well, I would say that actually I'm going to put
push back.
I'll put an asterisk on this, because of course this is true, and the Bible has, in the institution of the Eved Ivri, I think a very benevolent description of a kind of servitude. But I also think that it treats, there's no chidush. Maimonides says straight up that the Bible's description of the Eved Kanani, the non-Jewish slave, is not befitting the kindness of the Israelite people, the Jewish people. And so it is permitted, and we shouldn't behave that way, and we should cultivate a kindness. So I think it is ameliorated, and ameliorated is the way the Bible is. The Bible is not, the Bible is not Mao. It's not, we must wipe away the past and start anew. It's the Bible is, let's make the world better tomorrow than it was today.
Okay, so let's move to the next plague. We have the plague of locusts, and after the plague of locusts, we have the warning for the plague of darkness. God says to Moses, spread your hand over the sky, and there shall be darkness on the land of Egypt. We talked about that last, and you're going to feel this darkness. So Moses does this. There's darkness for 3 days. And one man didn't see his brother, and a man didn't get out from under him for 3 days. But the Israelites had light in there. It's such a gorgeous, gorgeous verse. Right? So many lovely sermons on the fact that there's light among the Jews, but there's not light among the Egyptians. But I want to go beyond this. Pharaoh's heart gets hardened again by Chazek Adonai lev Paro, and he refuses to let Moses go. And he says to Moses, Lech me'alai, get out of here, instead of bo, lech. Ishamer lecha, be warned, al tosef rot panai, do not see my face again. Ki biyom rotcha panai tamut. Now he's saying, the next time you see me, if you see me, you will die. Okay? Moses says, yeah, that's
nicely said.
Nicely said. So here he does hint or warn him that he's going to assassinate him. Okay, and it's such a great moment, because it's the moment that their anger spills out in the open. I mean, the idea that Pharaoh needs Moses as an opponent, it's over. Okay, the game. This is now in the 8th round, the 9th round, right? And he's had enough of him. You're not going to see, and of course there's irony, because we know the rest of the story. The rest of the story, he does come and see Pharaoh's again, and Pharaoh chases after him, and then kicks him out, sends him out. But I just want to get your reaction.
Well, the fact that, by the way, your conjecture that maybe Pharaoh needs Moshe in some respect is perhaps borne out with the fact that in the next parsha they're going to chase him down. So because now the Israelites leave and Paro's got us. Oh my God, what do we do? But we got to go back and get him, and that would bear out the idea that Pharaoh somehow is dependent upon this tension.
Yeah.
So what I would like to suggest is that the 10th plague is the great equalizer. So what we've seen in the first 9 plagues is that Pharaoh is removed pretty much from his people. They suffer plenty, but we don't really experience Pharaoh suffering at all from any of the plagues that have afflicted Egypt. We don't see him with any skin disease and him crying for food or not wondering what kind of water there is to drink. But once the firstborn are killed, the Pharaoh becomes just like every other Egyptian. And his house, which is the palace, of course, of the monarch, is just like any hovel in Egypt where there's a dead child. And I think the force of the statement is that when Moses says, yes, it's true, I will not see your face again, it means I will not see you as Pharaoh any longer. Because Pharaoh, and then what makes sense of Pharaoh chasing after him is that he realizes that he has to reclaim his status as Pharaoh. He has to do something militaristic. Because a Pharaoh letting a slave people go because he lost the contest with their God, well, you don't really recover from that, do you?
No, this is humiliating for him. This is beyond humiliating. It's also, desolation. There's destruction and death everywhere.
The poetic quality of the narrative is really quite strong. So I'm reading in chapter 12, verse 29.
Yes.
Vayehi b'chatzi halayla. Now it's midnight, and it's midnight because they're having a seder, because it's a seder. They're sitting up waiting. Vadunai hika kol b'chor beretz Mitzrayim. God strikes down every firstborn in the land of Egypt. Mi b'chor Paro hayoshev al kiso, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits upon the throne. Ad b'chor hashavi asher b'veit habor, down to the firstborn of the prisoner in the jail. V'chol b'chor behema, and every animal firstborn. And I get this line which really strikes me as packed with poetic power. Vayakum Paro laila, and Pharaoh rises in the night. Hu v'chol avadav, he and all the servants. V'chol Mitzrayim, and all of Egypt. V'tehit tza'aka gedola b'Mitzrayim, and there is this terrible cry throughout all of Egypt. Ki ein bayit asher ein sham met. There is no house in which there is not at least one dead person. The symmetry of the whole thing includes like the multiple factors. We've just been talking that verse from chapter 12 about dead children, God forbid, comes in the context of the description of the Passover ritual, which is even in the Torah all about children asking parents to tell me a story in some future generation. So the Jewish children are portrayed as at the edge of a great story, which gives meaning to their lives. The Egyptian children, there's a dead in every household. And then the part of the symmetry is the beginning of the story of the throwing the children into the river. So the children of the Egyptians threw the children of the Jews into the river. And now there is a midah keneged midah, a measure for measure element. I think in my experience in the synagogue rabbin in the United States, we American Jews who are comfortable, who's we're striking distance of the Shoah and people that we know who suffered tremendously, but we're not good for let's punish our enemies and make them squeal. But this passage does consider that all these plagues and all of this suffering and all of the especially the plague of the firstborn is just in the Torah's storytelling appears to be just compensation for all the Egyptian torture. It's like perhaps another American reference, the Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, in which he said every drop of blood spilled in this war is for every drop of blood drawn by the lash of slavery. That I think that's how the story is being told.
So there's
to put
symmetry.
a poetic
Go ahead. The symmetry
slant to it.
Yeah.
what we would say is that because the Egyptians have been unable or refused to hear the outcry of the Israelites, they will cry themselves and no one will hear them.
Well, so here I want
And
to
that's
push
the
back on
midah
that. I
keneged
just want to
midah.
ask. So could you then read Pharaoh's action as finally the act of a leader, which is when you just read, Jeremy, ki ein bayit asher ein shamed, which I admit sends a chill down every spine, right? There was no household in which there was not a dead body. Then the next verse, Vayikra Moshe u'Aaron. So he is summoning them to his palace, basically. Is that an act of leadership, an act of desperation? In other words, is he now taking control of the situation and saying, okay, go, kumu, tsu'u mitoch ami, get up, leave my people, gamatem, gamane Israel, you and the children of Israel, uluchu avdu et Adonai kidaberchem, go out as you said. And don't forget, we have a different reading of what's going on at night. I believe that they're still preparing the Korban Pesach, that they haven't eaten it, because of the timing. This is midnight. At midnight, they were probably just sitting down, and the proof of this is that they leave with the dough unbaked, and they don't bake it till the following morning, which is in this week's parsha. So is Pharaoh aware of that? Is Pharaoh acting desperately, or is he trying to reclaim? Is he the FEMA of Egypt here?
I think it's abject despair.
Yeah.
That he kind of throws his hands up and says, get out. It's not really leadership because he's been reduced to the level of the common Egyptian. The whole premise of being a pharaoh in Egypt is that the pharaoh is completely different from the ordinary Egyptian. In fact, he becomes a god. But this pharaoh is nowhere close to divinity now. He is no better than anyone else in Egypt. He's a pharaoh in name only. And the only thing he could do is chase the people away that the people have already wanted to leave. And they're going to go with all the jewelry that they've acquired so benevolently from their Egyptian neighbors who've already agreed to send them off.
The Egyptian,
right? He's not leading here; he's following.
The Egyptian.
I think he's getting out of the way of the events. Yeah. By the way, I just saw. I didn't actually watch to the end, but I saw some of a documentary called Descendant on Netflix. It's about this. It's an astonishing story. Late in the American slave period, after the importation of African slaves was already forbidden, this guy from Mobile, Alabama says, basically, screw you, I can do whatever I want. And he takes a ship and he goes to Africa and he gets some more slaves and he runs them up the Mobile River. And they are the final slaves imported into the United States. They're only slaves for an extremely short time because it's starting the Civil War. I think it happens like just before the Civil War. I think like 1858 or 1859 or something like that. And he does this, and then he actually destroys the ship, and part of the film is them searching for the ship. And because it's pretty late time, they actually know the individual slaves, and there are pictures of and interviews with. And Zora Neale Hurston, the writer, wrote a book interviewing the descendants of these individual people. We have like actual pictures. And so the leader of the group, the man's name was Cudjoe. After the Civil War, he goes to the guy who stole them from Africa and brought them here. He says, like, you owe us some land. And the guy says, I don't owe you anything. I treated you all very well. And that is like a particularly disgusting feature of the story. And it's actually not what the Egyptians are portrayed as doing in the Torah. The Egyptians are portrayed as saying, man, you guys can take all this stuff with interest. You deserve it.
There's a sense of compensation, that they're leaving with birchush gadol, with great wealth. And look, I think the Torah justifies its benevolence to Egyptians later on. I mean, Ammonites and Moabites, we've talked about this before, they're not allowed to join, but an Egyptian, you're not supposed to, harm Egyptians. You're not supposed to treat Egyptians badly because you lived in Egypt. There's a certain kind of benevolence towards Egypt. So we're almost at the end here, and This is the foundation of Pesach. This is the foundation of we would go as far as to say Jewish identity. This identity is formed in this moment. It's chaotic. It's incredible. It's when we populate our imaginations with what's going on in the middle of the night. I have a kind of scenario where they didn't get to eat. They're leaving hungry. They're pretty obedient to Moses. This is I would say the sermon I gave or given on this or would give is probably the only time that the people of Israel listen to Moses.
However, they should listen to you, Elliot.
Exactly. No, I mean there's a certain orderliness in the disorder here, and we get from this moment we get the moment of ordering in Jewish life, namely the seder, which is the ordered ritual of telling the story.
But we also get the creation of the religion, because the religious piece of Judaism is that redemption can only come from the hand of God.
Yeah.
That if we don't have that concept, then whatever else we might have, whatever our Jewish identity might be, I don't know that we have a religion. And the Parsha is going to close with the ritual that implements vessels that we come to know as tefilin, because to remind us every day that we make our own hand strong by binding the tefillin to it, and we have the totafot to give us a kind of divine vision so that we can see more clearly, and because we can never forget that this redemption is different from everything else. This is God's work.
So interesting you mentioned that, and when I've taught this, lately I've been influenced by in the pictures, Egyptian pictures. So there is the outstretched arm of the Pharaoh, right? Lots and lots of Egyptian pictures of Pharaoh with an outstretched arm, and so the idea is that this is an inversion of that. But if you read carefully, as you said here, so the last verse, that this which we identify as tefillin, but what is it that is in it? It's the name of God. So by binding the name of God to your flesh, which was what we do with tefillin, we are saying this is our power. This is what gives us power. We become literally the bearers of God's name, the bearers of a text on our body. There's actually one more physical mitzvah than tefillin that is worn on the body. Okay, well,
at least in principle, that mitzvah is only for half the human species or half the Jewish people, but the other one, we've done our best as conservative Jews to ask the women to put on the tefillin. It hasn't really worked, but we didn't legislate the other one for them. Barry, can you repeat something you said earlier? The homo ludens. What is the definition there?
Johann Huizinga was a great medieval history. He wrote a book called Homo Ludens. This was at a time when people were trying to figure out what made human beings unique, and man the tool maker. So Huizinga said it's man the games player. It was someone, because what people do is create rituals, and the meaning of a ritual is in doing the ritual, right? Baseball, for example, has no transcendent significance. It's kind of a silly game if you don't know the rules, but we invest it with meaning and it becomes our game. And that's true for a whole sphere of human endeavor. And a lot of religion is wrapped up in that too, because when you think of the things that we do that have the greatest significance, they are quite prosaic acts. I mean, let's face it, drinking a glass of wine is not necessarily all that special, but when you make a bracha or you sanctify a day out of the week with it, then it becomes very powerful.
When you said it the first time, you said a particularly, I thought, elegant formulation. What was it, like a human activity? Well,
I don't know. You have to listen to the show.
Okay, sure. But I think that it is really significant in our throngs of listeners may want to just think about this one fact, which is that the first mitzvot in the Torah there's like a little asterisk on this, but as general convention, the first mitzvah in the Torah is these mitzvot surrounding the Pesach ritual. The Chodesh Elachem Rosh Chodeshim. Here's how you begin counting the calendar, and here's what I want you to do to celebrate this Exodus, and you're going to smear blood on the doorpost, which is not something obviously that has succeeded has lasted until today, but presumably at one time was part of the actual ritual that people did. And these things are incredibly heavy duty, poetically, mythically laden activities. So I differ a little bit. Like the activities are prosaic. I mean, they could be prosaic if you were a Martian, but if you're a Jew, they bear an enormous amount of significance. And these are the deeds by which we internalize the messages, we internalize the identity, we internalize the story, we internalize the idea and the themes. And so Parashat Bo is a really big parsha for not just a story that happened to ancient people, but the nexus point between the ancient people and the followers of Judaism to this day.
That's such a great note. We'll end on that note. It encodes us with the narrative, as you say. And so, and you mentioned our viewers, our listeners, and we want to thank them for watching and listening. Spread the word about our beautiful Parsha Talk, where we have couple hundred people watching and listening on a weekly basis. We're so proud of you. We thank you. We're happy that you join us, and we look forward to wrestling and thinking about next week's Parsha, B'Shalach, on our next edition of Parsha Talk. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.